Okay, so this is going to be chapter 6. Get it on screen here. Chapter 6 again finishes off our uh, unit 2 section here of 4, 5, and 6. So this will be the last chapter before we um, begin having the discussions about our final, and I can pull that up there. It's moved it on me there. Move the icon. Okay. In the building right now, sorry, I'm a little distracted. They're doing a fire alarm test, and that started going off about the time I started this, and we had some sirens in the background if you heard that. It is a test, but I knew it was coming sometime this afternoon. Just caught me off guard a little bit when the sirens started. But again, this is the end of chapter 6, ending the unit 2. The lecture test will be this week, so it'll cover 4, 5, and 6. And as we talked about, chapter 6 is covering respiration. So the glucose that we made in chapter 5, now we're going to tear it down and access the energy out of it. This is another fairly small chapter in terms of notes, about 24 slides, I believe. So again, not quite as large as the ones before. So again, that which we made in chapter 5, that glucose through the process of photosynthesis, now we're going to break it down. And plants and animals all go through respiration. Obviously, plants make their own food. We ingest our food. But all of us, our main goal is to produce ATP, which we said was an energy carrier used to power the cell and all the activities and work that the body does. The process of using glucose and oxygen to produce ATP is called aerobic respiration. Now we'll talk about anaerobic respiration as well in this chapter. Aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic means without oxygen. And if you're wondering how to spell anaerobic, you just put an A-N in front of aerobic, and that's anaerobic. So the chemical formula for that, you start with glucose and oxygen, and that yields carbon dioxide, water, and 36 ATP. So keep that in mind. That's the payoff for us, is 36 ATP molecules per molecule of glucose. That's the goal. So cellular respiration, again, is linked to breathing. So when you breathe in, obviously you take in oxygen, and it gets consumed in the process of respiration, which is, again, the breakdown of glucose. And that carbon dioxide, that byproduct that is created, is actually exhaled when you breathe out. So again, carbon dioxide exhaled, oxygen inhaled. The exact opposite of what we talked about in chapter 5, where plants brought in carbon dioxide and then give off oxygen. I'll mention what we're talking about, carbon dioxide and oxygen. If you ever have plants, house plants, things like that, they say that plants benefit from you talking to them. And actually what scientists have found is that when you speak directly to a plant, obviously you're giving off carbon dioxide. Plants enjoy carbon dioxide. They use it to make food. So the extra carbon dioxide that you're giving them actually boosts them a little bit in terms of their photosynthetic abilities. So there is something to that idea and that thought that talking to your plants benefits them, because you are emitting carbon dioxide when you do that. So again, the payoff for all of this is that ATP is formed, which allows us to do work such as muscle contractions. And obviously you see this lady running here, and as you run, your muscles are going to work and increase in their activity. And that means you have to have more energy. And that means you have to bring in more oxygen. And that's why you see people, when they start breathing hard, their body's trying to keep up with the oxygen needed to access this energy. So oxygen is a key component in making this thing go. The more oxygen you can bring in, the more energy you can access. So bringing in oxygen is a big thing in terms of respiration. So these slides now are going to get a little busy in terms of the writing on here. And again, they're kind of lengthy and detailed. We're going to go through the steps of cellular respiration. Now, photosynthesis, if you remember in the last chapter, has 2 basic steps. Respiration actually occurs in 3 stages, and there's more components to that, but there's 3 main stages. The first one is glycolysis, and this is where glucose, that 6-carbon chain of glucose that we see here, that again, the plant created through photosynthesis, you get by eating food, actually splits into 2 pyruvates. Notice that glycolysis happens outside in the cytoplasm. And again, when we talked about cells, this is this protein matrix, this viscous fluid that surrounds all of the organelles, such as mitochondria, within a cell. So again, it's just floating around out here. Glycolysis is the only stage that actually happens outside of the mitochondrion. Everything else in terms of respiration is going to happen inside the mitochondrion, except for glycolysis. Glycolysis in the Krebs cycle transfers some of the potential energy in glucose to ATP. Meanwhile, electrons are transferred to NADH and FADH2. You see those here, NADH, FADH2. Those are energy carriers just like ATP that are designed specifically for respiration. So in chapter 5, we talked about photosynthesis and that photosystem 2, the first step, if you recall, produced ATP. The second step, photosystem 1, actually produced NADPH. And I said to remember the P stands for photosynthesis. Doesn't really, but it helps you remember which process you're in. So NADPH is created during photosynthesis in photosystem 1. NADH, FADH2, energy carriers for respiration. And again, this all occurs in the mitochondria. And then we talked about the mitochondria again, and we said it had these folds, these cristae, these intermembrane folds, and then there's an outer membrane here as well. There's also circular DNA. There's ribosomes in here. So we said again, just like your chloroplast in plants, these things probably existed outside the cell at some point and were engulfed and brought in to perform their functions here. And again, as the old saying goes, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. They are the ones that are producing energy for the cell in the form of ATP. So again, this is kind of where everything happens, is in this mitochondrial matrix within inside that mitochondrion. So glycolysis, we're going to focus on it and kind of work our way through all of these steps. As we said, it occurs outside the mitochondrion cytoplasm. It splits the glucose into 2 pyruvates. Pyruvates, again, are just cleaved portions of the glucose, breaking it down into smaller particles. The enzymes of glycolysis extract some of the potential energy stored in glucose, and the process itself yields this. What do we get out of it? We get 2 NADHs, 2 of these pyruvates, and 2 ATP. Okay, so that's what we get out of it. So remember, we're looking for 36 molecules ATP. So glycolysis only produces 2. And it actually requires the input of 2 ATP to activate the glucose, if you will, to get it ready for that splitting here and adding that phosphate on here, getting it ready to go into production. Each of the 3 carbon molecules proceeds to the energy extraction point. First, each 3 carbon molecule is oxidized, which means that it loses an electron, producing 2 NADH molecules. Okay, oxidization means that it's losing electrons, so electrons are spent. Then each 3 carbon molecule donates its phosphate groups to ADP molecules, producing ATP molecules. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4 here. In total, 4 ATP were produced. But remember, we had to spend 2 to start this reaction. So the net yield is 2 ATP from glycolysis. Even though it produces 4, we had to have 2 to start. So 2 of these are going to circle back and come back to this right here and fire up the engine. Kind of a primer, if you will, to prime the engine to get it started. This reaction does not require oxygen and is therefore can occur in anaerobic conditions. So glycolysis, we really can't stop. We can take oxygen away from the other parts and kind of slow down respiration, but we can't stop glycolysis because it is anaerobic. It occurs without oxygen. So this is a kind of a constant process. As we said, 2 ATPs formed in glycolysis. And the next step that the big one that we're fixing to hit is Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle, again, is kind of inside here, this mitochondrial membrane, this matrix is where it's going to occur. So as we move this thing across the membrane folds, a carbon atom is stripped from that pyruvate and leaves the cell as carbon dioxide molecules. So carbon dioxide gets produced in this step. And again, carbon dioxide is a byproduct of this, and we have to exhale it. So we do that every time we take a breath. We get rid of the carbon dioxide that's produced by this movement across the glucose to pyruvate into this 2-carbon chain. At this point, we call this acetyl-CoA, coenzyme A, acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA, actually, you can purchase that at the GNC. It is a natural energy supplement, and the thought being that the acetyl-CoA would go into your system and access into your mitochondria to give you energy. Because again, ATP is a form of cellular energy. Now, the efficacy of that happening can be debated. Obviously, it has to be absorbed into the mitochondria, and not everything that goes into your system in pill form actually does that. So again, that is the premise behind it, is that it's a natural energy supplement. That acetyl-CoA is going to move now into the Krebs cycle. And during the Krebs cycle, the 2 acetyl-CoA molecules are oxidized again, losing electrons, yielding 4 carbon dioxides, 2 ATP, 6 NADHs, 2 FADH2s. So that's a mouthful there. So again, energy carriers, not much ATP here. So we got 2 out of glycolysis. We're going to get 2 out of the Krebs cycle as well, but we're making several other energy carriers, NADH and FADH2. And you notice that this cycle, again, is circular, just like what we had in chapter 5 with photosynthesis. This guy is a circle as well. Since we used Wheel in the Sky the last time, let's go to another song. Let's call this the Wagon Wheel. We'll just call this the Wagon Wheel, the Old Crow Medicine Show, or Darius Rucker, whichever version you prefer there of that song. But this wagon wheel spins, and its goal is to produce these things that we see here. So again, there's an acetyl-CoA molecule, 2 carbons. What I want you to realize is that there are 2 of these. You see that, 2 of these, and you're only seeing 1 here. There's a second wagon wheel spinning off picture here. 2 of those, 2 ADPs, 6 NADAs, and 2 FADAs. So basically, they charge up, they prime up here, and form these energy carriers. And again, 2 wagon wheels, so you double up everything that you see in this picture. So this is what we got so far. At this point, it says we've got 10 NADH molecules from those steps, 2 FADH molecules. And what happens with all these electron carrier molecules? Well, it's time for the payoff. We've only made 4 total ATP, net ATP. We need to make 36. And there's only 1 step remaining, and it is the final step. And this is the electron transport chain that should look very familiar as compared to the photosynthetic chain. So if you watch chapter 5, you notice that we had this and we had it bouncing across here. But this is where most of the electrons are going to be cashed in to produce the ATP. As these electrons move through the transport chain, carrier molecules use potential energy of the electrons to transport hydrogen ions into the inner membrane compartment. Just like before with photosynthesis, we're going to suck hydrogen in. We have ATP synthase, just like photosynthesis, gluing these molecules together to form ATP. So at the end of the transport chain, electrons are donated to an oxygen atom, which combines with the hydrogens to form water. All right. So on the test, how do you keep it straight? If you have a picture and you're trying to figure out which one is which, well, there's some telltale signs. First off, let's start right here. Oxygen comes in at this point here. Remember, oxygen is created as a byproduct of the first stage of photosynthesis. Water is created here. Remember, water is what we start with as an ingredient, again, a reactant that splits and donates the electrons here. Also notice there is no light energy coming in here. We have to have light for photosynthesis. There is no light energy here. It's NADH and FADH2. That's what's powering this process. So those are some telltale signs to kind of keep you straight. And again, even though we're still making ATP, hydrogen still being sucked in, those are ways that you can keep this straight. And the electron transport chain itself produces 34 ATP in this stage alone, 34 ATP. Now, you're probably sitting there thinking, now that doesn't add up right, because we made 2 ATP in the glycolysis and Krebs cycle, and we just made 34 ATP. Well, that's 38, not 36. So what happened? Well, actually, what happened is transporting the NADH into the mitochondria required 2 ATP. So to get it from here across that membrane, it actually burned 2 ATP. So the net yield is 36. Okay, so we didn't show that to you as we went through there, but there was 2 ATP cached in here to make that thing come across that membrane. And that's what gets us 36. Now, again, as we talked about, there are other ways to extract energy besides that glucose that we just kind of followed along through here. There are other ways. Fats can be broken down into glycerols and fatty acids and come into the program here. You see kind of how they fit in here. Proteins can come in here as well and be cashed in for energy. You know, if you've ever seen anybody that's been starved or very sick, you know, they become emaciated, and the energy is burned from their body. You know, we burn our starch and glycogen first, then we'll start burning fat. You know, if you've ever been on a weight loss program, you know how that works. And then if you go too far, obviously you can start burning protein and losing muscle mass. The body is very, very good at finding energy sources. It will burn up everything that you see here until it can't survive. And again, people that are very ill, people that have been starved, you probably have seen those pictures of, you know, almost like a walking skeleton. That's because the body is looking for other energy sources. Fermentation generates ATP only in glycolysis. So fermentation is the process of breaking down glucose anaerobically without oxygen. Now, again, that'll only produce 2 ATP. It doesn't produce a lot of ATP, but again, it does produce some ATP for energy. And again, you know, this respiration is a degradation process, a decomposition process of breaking things down. We can control it by limiting the oxygen that we have, limiting the temperature, things like that, but you're never going to stop it because of this anaerobic fermentation. In alcoholic fermentation, it says NADH reduces pyruvate to ethanol, and that's what produces the alcohol. In lactic acid fermentation, as you see in our muscles down here, NADH reduces pyruvate to lactic acid. Still only creating 2 ATPs, but lactic acid, you may have heard, and you see the guy out here lifting weights, feel the burn. You ever heard of that saying, feel the burn? Well, that's exactly what you're talking about there, because you've basically worked this to a point, these muscles to a point where they can't get enough oxygen to them to create that energy. And you start producing lactic acid and it burns, it hurts, you're sore. Very common, obviously, with workouts and things of that nature, but that's just your body trying to keep up with your energy demands. So the last one here, always a did you know, it says plants that serve as insect brothels. So this one is actually in your book talking about these philodendrons, these lily plants that actually produce warm flowers. And in fact, they do this by prematurely transferring electrons to oxygen. Instead of extracting the remaining potential energy in electrons, the energy is lost as heat. Now, heat energy is not recaptured, but they do this on purpose. They don't want to be efficient. They want these beetle pollinators to come in and be attracted there. And it's a symbiotic relationship. You know, the plant benefits from having the beetle pollinators there to pollinate the flowers. The beetles actually benefit because they use less energy in having to find food and mates. So again, it's just like a little mating area for these beetles. And of course, the flowers are successfully propagated by the beetles, a little bit of the birds and bees, if you will. So again, that ends our discussion over chapter 6 on respiration. So we'll stop right there. And as we said at the beginning, this also is the end of unit 2 for chapters 4, 5, and 6, and that's what your second lecture test will be over. So if you have any questions, be sure and reach out to me.